Welcome to Prose and Cons, a podcast by writers for writers, brought to you by Precipice Fiction. Precipice Fiction would like to acknowledge the people of the Eora and Durag nations as the original custodians and storytellers of the land this podcast was created on.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to a very special episode of the Prose and Cons podcast, where sometimes we feel like prose and sometimes we feel like cons. Today, I'll be your host, James Healy, and I will be interviewing my good friend, Elul. Matan, why don't you introduce yourself to the listeners?
Hi. I never thought I'll be in this position. Certainly not with you. I mean, in a good way. I'm happy to be in this position with you. My name is Matan-verse. I'm an English teacher by day. I'm exactly 1/6 of Precipice Fiction, for which I write and edit. And yeah, I'll say the rest in the interview, I guess.
Perfect. Yes. And yes, I guess I feel like it was a little bit of not quite an ambush, but we did show up with not so much. I guess I showed up with interview questions more than topics to discuss. So this is a couple of questions that I've been interested to kind of chat with you for a while now. So I'm delighted to get this opportunity. Essentially, yeah. Where I wanted to jump in and start was, where do you think writing started for you, and when did you get into it?
I know it's going to sound cheesy and a bit like a cliche, but I quite literally think I started when I was 5, 6 years old. And I think that's more of a credit to my mom than to myself.
Okay.
Because at some point in my very, very early childhood, I guess I started, making up crazy mumbo jumbo to her. And at some point, I assume she just went like, hey, we should write that down. So my first writing experience is me telling a story to my mom. I think I was 5 years old, maybe 4, 6, something in that range. And my mom just happened to be a graphic designer for a newspaper. So she knew a guy that knew a guy, and they put my story in the town newspaper. It's a very small town, like a few thousand people. And there it was. I wrote that weird story about a knight going to save his older brother from, if I recall, a rather wicked wizard. And yeah, I guess past that point, it's really just me pushing the limits of what my mom is willing to sit down and listen to. Like at first, it would be short stuff, and the next major thing was around 12 years old. We had literature class in school, and I don't know how I got this crazy idea, but I thought, I'm just gonna write a story and tell my teacher about it and see what happens. And she decided to read it to the class. And I think that was a big moment for me, James. Like that it changed something. It made it real in a way, because suddenly it wasn't just my mother listening to stuff, but like a classroom of children. And yeah, from that point on, step by step, and now we're here.
Excellent. And after school, when would you say was the first time that you sat down to write a story kind of your own volition, that wasn't maybe something that your mother was encouraging or something that was maybe school mandated?
Well, I think we'll call it that way. The first time I sat down to write a story in a mature, I'm gonna, send it out into the world kind of way and not just show it to the people around me. I think it was quite late. It was maybe when I was 18 or 19. I was doing my military service, which is mandatory in my country, and I had a lot of time to think. And surprisingly, what came out were these rhymed, almost nursery tales about a lot of talking animals and stuff. And I found this website called Writers Cafe. I don't know if you've ever heard about it.
Writers Cafe, no. I'll look at it.
Yeah, and I don't know if it still exists, but yeah. So I started, publishing these very innocent stories. These rhymed, metered stories into that website, and just learning. Starting to get feedback and that was pretty big for me. Um, I didn't publish under my name, but still, it was the first time I was, I guess, thinking about this in a serious way. Like maybe this is a thing I can actually do, and not just a weird thing I do for fun.
Cool. Okay. And you had something published as well, didn't you? A couple of years ago.
Oh yeah, that that came unexpectedly. Well, maybe that's not the right word to use because I was actively trying to publish. When I moved to Australia, I was 22, and James, I had this crazy idea that I'm just going to show up in Australia, and within 3 or 4 months, I'm going to have a book contract with preferably one of the big five. So I
Amazing.
show up, I show up in Australia with the manuscript for my first book. It's all ready. I'm like, okay, now I'm just gonna, find a job to pay the rent and send a bunch of emails, and that would be the end of it. And then I realized it takes sometimes it can take years, like literally can take a year and a half for a publisher to get back to you.
Mm.
So I thought, okay, what's the plan? And obviously, I did what all the clueless people do is I went on Google, and Google said, if you're a writer and you're trying to make it, you should write short stories because those get rejected or accepted much faster. So that can kind of help you build yourself. And I've been sending stories all over the place, like competitions, magazines, and maybe you know that experience. Like you send so much stuff to so many places that by the time you get an answer, you don't even know who these people are or what you've sent them.
Yeah.
And I remember I was in college. I was taking some college seminars in Australia, and I get this email. Dear Matan, would be happy to publish your story. Here's $100. And I'm like, who the hell are these people? What story do they have? And I started going to my sent, to my sent inbox. Like, is that a thing? Like,
Yeah.
to see what have I sent these people? And it was a story called Our House, which was a horror story. Um, it's a story I actually read in parts in the writing group in Australia, the open genre writing group. And the place that has accepted it and decided to publish it was called Dimension 6. I think the editor is from Newtown. It's a
Oh wow.
nice,
Okay.
yeah, local Australian thing. It's a horror story. Um, in a nutshell, this guy has a wife that died a year ago, and at the beginning of the story, the wife is kind of coming up the stairs, and he shoots her, and basically every night she comes back to life and tries to kill him. That's
Oh
the
my God. Okay.
that's the story. Yeah.
Nice. Very creepy. Yeah. It's definitely at home in the horror
Yeah.
section there. Do you find yourself mostly drawn to horror? And mostly that's what you're most comfortable in or what you most prefer to write?
I know this is an interview, but I'm so tempted to turn this question on you. Um, I guess we both are, aren't we?
We'll stick with you. Stick with you for now.
Yeah. I
Don't want to split
guess.
the listener's attention.
Sorry. Okay, so here's the thing. I love reading horror, but I never loved it over the other things. Like I loved fantasy, sci-fi, horror, historical fiction. I read a lot of horror books, but it never felt like it's something that I read more than the other things, if that makes sense. Yeah, I had, like 4 or 5 Stephen Kings. I had Michael Crichton. Am I saying his name right? The guy who wrote Jurassic Park. I had never let the right ones in. I had a bunch of them, but it never felt like a thing for me until I started to write short stories. And something about short stories, the functionality of horror as a genre just kind of felt right. There's something about that because let's be honest, a short story is like a short conversation, right? You got to get to the point quickly. And if you're a fantasy writer like me, a lot of the things I enjoy the most is the world building and, just crafting this massive behemoth of a world. And you can't do that in a short story. So I think that's what made me gravitate towards horror because I felt like in horror, you can kind of get to the point quickly. And as I found myself trying to, punch out these short stories one after the other because I wanted to send them all over the place, I kept finding myself, like coming up with these scary little stories because I found that they grabbed me immediately. Like when you think about a hook, right? The hook is so important when you're writing a story, and maybe 10 times as important when you're writing a short story or flash fiction. Like the hook has to be so much sharper when it's something short. And I don't know, just the middle of the night, a few knocks coming down the stairs, like that just grabbed me. And I thought, and again, it might sound anticlimactic, but yeah, I think I write a lot of horror because it works well with the phase that I am in, which is just shooting as many short stories into the ether.
So it's more that you favor short stories than horror, and it just happens to be that is the best way to tell or your preferred way to tell a horror story. That's excellent. Okay. So outside of the short story format, what do you normally like to write, or what do you find yourself writing or gravitating towards mostly?
Sure. Okay. So I think we've discussed it in a few episodes, and imitation, the cliche, it's the highest form of flattery is imitation. I also think it's a very good way to learn your craft and to create your own voice. Maybe it sounds a little cheap, but even when you're a baby and you're learning the language, the first thing you do is you imitate mom and dad. And in a way, I think as writers, at least at the beginning, whether consciously or subconsciously, we kind of imitate the writers that we look up to. And when I first started writing, especially the big projects, I was imitating the big projects that I like to write. The foundational pieces of my Matan's literary canon, whatever that is. And naturally, what came out is like Harry Potter copycats and Lord of the Ring copycats. Like that
Excellent.
that
Okay.
that's the two divergent branches of my creativity in my late teens and my early writing career. And of course, Game of Thrones is going crazy back then. And it's like it's really hard not to have my knights say the F word early on in my writing because that's what you're getting. So my first serious story, I was trying to write a fantasy, and as I was writing it, I'm like, this is probably the uh disappointing stepchild of Tolkien and J.R.R. Martin. And then as I became more aware of, okay, it's okay to be impressed by these guys, but I still want to write Matan. I don't want to write, I don't want to write Martin. I don't want to write Tolkien. And that's how I think I moved into something that ironically kind of drew from my late fascination with horror. Because horror, as I explained, kind of came into my life out of necessity. I read horror, I loved it, but writing horror was a necessity. It was like, okay, I need short stories that work for me. And what happened is that the projects that I've been working on the last 5-6 years have been this kind of amalgamation of horror that came in because I needed it and the fantasy that I grew up on. And what came up is like this dark fantasy that I would like to think has the maturity of a Martin book, but also the innocence and the kindness that I would like to think is something that is Matan, something I put into my stories, which is the world is hard and difficult and reality is dark, but there is kindness, and it's worth telling stories about the kindness that we're capable of. And I think that recently I've been trying to do that consciously, not just let it happen naturally.
Brilliant. So when you say consciously, do you mean instead of letting it kind of come across in the story, you've been trying to like purposely shape the story around that, or find the ways of expressing that throughout the story?
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm really trying to find characters and situations in which kindness has a price, because I think that reflects how I feel. I feel that kindness is not always easy, and that is the kindness that we need to preserve. That is the goodness that we need to preserve. And in a way, having characters that care for each other and are willing to sacrifice for one another in a world that is dangerous, that is harsh, that it would make so much sense to just care for yourself. I think that's the beautiful part. Not to spoil, but that's what I've been trying to do. For example, in one of my projects, I have this character who's a drug addict, and he ends up being kind of this unlikely mentor for this girl who's having problems. And instead of going in the direction of, oh, he's a drug addict, he's harsh, he's jaded. Instead, I'm trying to show different aspects of, okay, he's got his problems, but that doesn't mean he's beyond kindness, politeness, caring, and that sort of stuff. And I think that's also what I enjoy to write, and that's what I feel is unique, especially because as we're reaching the subversion, so much of the content that we see nowadays is the subversion of genre, right? You see it in The Boys subverting the superhero genre, Deadpool and Wolverine, subverting with satire. That's everything is so meta nowadays, like it's almost too cheesy to have something that is a straight shooter, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And that's the nature of art, right? You have cowboy movies, and then you have like the subversion of the Western. If you have True Steel and that kind of stuff, where the cowboy is suddenly this jaded, damaged human being. And maybe I'm just waiting in the wings for the wheel to turn by the time I'm ready to publish, for people to maybe want something that is a little um more of escapism, if that makes sense.
Mm. A little bit more heartfelt and genuine as well, that it's kind of embracing back into what the genre was, or what it meant. So yeah, I think that's wonderful. I think that's a wonderful. I'm certainly am finding I'm missing those kind of stories myself. So I think that time might be coming. And as well as that, I think it's a yeah, yeah. As well as that, I think it's a wonderful message that you were describing there, with the kind of kindness, that the kindness has a cost, and that's why it should still be promoted. I think that's really beautiful. I would certainly say that I get that feeling off the characters that I've seen in your stories, that they definitely, there's a tremendous amount of humanity in them, despite some of the darker environments that they're in, and the dark plots that they're going through. They remain to be quite, just quite kind, generous people. So yeah, I think that's a good thing you're leaning into there, and I'm really enjoying it.
Thank you.
Another thing I wanted to ask you about your writing was that you predominantly write outside of your native language.
Yes.
Yeah.
Ooh, where to start with that, Ben?
Yeah.
So, James, you've joined the writers group, I think, 2020, right? After COVID.
Yeah,
You've
after
missed,
COVID.
you've missed my early years. I joined a couple of years before you. And okay, so I was always good in English. I had high grades. I started writing in English back home before I moved to Australia. I was already writing in English. But there is something about living inside a language that cannot be replicated by anything else.
Hmm.
I've read hundreds of books in English. I watched every possible kind of accent on any kind of TV show. And yet, until I was immersed in English, living in a crappy apartment in Haymarket, Sydney, I haven't, I can't even describe it. So, what would happen is that I would show up to the writers' meetings and I would have my stories. And what they would do is, like Jack and Helen specifically, because they're kind, they would just underline certain words I would use, and on top of them they would write WC, word choice, which basically meant the word you chose here is not incorrect grammatically, but it's weird. Like a native English speaker wouldn't use that word in that way. And sometimes it felt like a strength in that the writing could feel fresh because I just didn't know where the cliches in certain situations. But in other times, it felt like, oh, this really jumped out. And something that really helped my confidence, I think, is starting to teach English, because I always felt like I've learned the language, but it is such a deep well. You have to. There's so much to it. And when I started teaching it, when I started really, getting to know the technical aspects of the language, that's where I found a new level of familiarity with it, a new level of confidence in my writing too, because now that I probably know grammar better than a big chunk of the native English speakers, for example. And having lived in Australia for 5 years, basically That was very necessary. And still sometimes I ask myself, like, man, why'd you take the hard road? Why not just write in Hebrew? You know, that's your language that could have saved you maybe a few years. And again, similar to my answer for the horror question, it's a very pragmatic answer. It's just there are several billion people who might read it in English one day. Okay, maybe there are less than billions of people who speak English, but the potential is tremendous. Whereas um, an optimistic assessment would be 15 million Hebrew speakers out there. So, yep, more readers. English it is. That was it.
Okay, yeah. And it's been challenging, would you say, or would you say you took easily enough to it?
In a way, it was incredibly challenging, but I just wonder. I wonder what it's like for you guys, because when I write in English, it's almost like I'm looking I'm looking at the picture through a lens, because there's my brain, there's this English veil that I'm looking through, and then there's the story. And obviously, the more I do it, the thinner this veil becomes, and maybe it's already gone. Who knows? But I still have that thing, and I always wonder. Like sometimes I would read one of your stories, and you would use such a simple word. Like I don't know, you would use the word veranda. I don't know, whatever. And I'd be like, oh man, I never use that word because it just doesn't
Uh,
come to me. And yeah, that's the kind of things that sometimes plague my writing process.
okay, okay. Can I ask what do you think you've learned about maybe about language in kind of having an understanding of writing in two different languages?
Um, hmm. I gotta say, I've been doing a bit of editing to translated works recently as part of the publishing house I started to work with. So basically, what I'm doing is that I receive an English copy of a book that was originally written in Hebrew, and I kind of get to see the differences. And it
Ah,
also
okay.
happened,
Oh, that's very cool.
yeah. And it also happened that I used to read, like, for example, Harry Potter books 1 to 5, I originally read in Hebrew. And then I was impatient for 6 and 7, so I read them in English as a kid. But then I reread them all in English. And the same thing with Shakespeare. I was first exposed to Shakespeare in Hebrew, and now obviously I'm reading him in English. And there's okay, let's just put it out there. English is Frankenstein's monster. Okay, it's a bloody abomination, is what it is. It's been ravaged by several cultures with absolutely no regards for the poor students who hundreds of years later will have to deal with it. It makes no utter sense. Like, what's wrong with the letter K? Why are we ignoring it whenever it starts a word? Uh, English phonetically is a freaking maze. Okay, but back to the translation thing, it's just like, with all that being said, all of my criticism of how English, the Vikings come, they change it, the Normans come, they change it. It's really a mess. With all that being said, it's such a beautiful language, and it is such a deep language for poems, poetry, for writing. It has such depth in a way because it is so messy. Because you can, when you look at English, you can feel German influences, you can feel Latin influences, definitely French influences. Maybe you, as an Irish person, you can also feel the Celtic influence. I don't know, because I guess it goes both ways, right? Like you kind of enforce the language goes to Scotland and Ireland. I guess it comes back in a way that's also a little different.
Very
And
different, yeah.
and it's just that messiness of the language. It's somehow it creates such beauty. And maybe I'm just brainwashed by Shakespeare, but the things you can do with it, holy crap. Like I just can't imagine that with Hebrew. And I I don't know if that's because Hebrew hasn't been used for 2000 years that much except for prayer. Like
Mm.
Latin, let's take Latin for example. Could you write Shakespeare in Latin and preserve the wittiness, the depth of language, the multiple meanings? I'm not sure, because that language is so, how do we call it? It's got a purpose, and that's what it's used for, right? It's used for prayers, and uh I'm not sure what else, to be honest. And in a way, that's kind of how Hebrew felt until very recently. in that you would use it to read the Bible, and that's about it. And slowly, I think it's growing in recent years. But yeah, that's my love-hate relationship with your language.
Hmm. Oh yeah, okay. I guess I'll take it. I was gonna go in and say it's not my language. It's gonna get all nationalist.
Well, let's open it, James. Do you speak another language?
No, I mean I don't speak Irish particularly well, but the reason I was interested in the question was because the different way that the Irish language conceptualizes things and the different way that the English language conceptualizes things turns simple phrases like "I am hungry" in English into "I have hunger upon me" in Irish, and
That's
you might say that they're
that's
not
like
different.
Spanish. That's a bit like
Yeah.
Spanish. In Spanish, you have hunger. You are not hungry. Hebrew
Yes. Yeah.
is very simple. In Hebrew, it's I hungry.
Right. Okay. Okay.
Yeah,
Straight to the point. Okay, that's
straight to the
interesting.
point. Yeah,
Yeah.
2,000 years ago, didn't have time. The Romans were
Yeah.
chasing them.
Yes. Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah. I always felt that part of the reason that the Irish have a bit of a reputation for being poetic was simply that the Irish language lent itself very well to kind of maybe romanticism and poeticism a little bit. So that
Mm.
kind of helps things. So I was wondering if you know it's anything similar with Hebrew and working with Hebrew in English, because you definitely have a lot of um, very nice and kind of unusual phrases in your writing that I always find really stick with you, simply because they're like a little bit different. And I'm like, oh, I wonder if that's a like a Hebrew influence coming in. Kind of if that's the way that they might phrase that in Hebrew.
I'm sure it is. I'm sure it is.
Yeah.
Whether I like it or not, like that's what you get. Like, um, it is there. But yeah, living in Australia for 5 years helped me kind of like we've discussed it. To break the rules, you got to know the rules. So
Mm, yeah.
I feel like I still have these things, but I try to be more aware when I do it, like to know that I've come up with a phrase that's a bit off kilter, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. To do it intentionally rather than, although there is an
Yeah.
art to, yeah, there is an art to capitalizing upon a mistake as well. But yeah, I know what you mean by
Yeah.
doing it with intention. So I'd like to ask you about your story Absolution we've been working on.
Whew.
And I know I can see you getting
Uh,
tense.
this is the equivalent of meeting your aunt in a wedding and her asking, "Why are you still single?" That's that's literally how this feels for me. But no, it's good that you're asking. Like, are you in general asking how's the book, or like, how is it doing, or
um,
just
no, I guess what I
letting me
wanted to
plug?
ask.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's gonna it's doubling as a plug, but I wanted to ask where does the idea or look before I ask, why don't you give the readers a little bit of an explanation of what this is, and
All
then the main
right.
question. I'll ask my main question after that.
Okay. So I'll explain, dear listeners, if you're there. So basically, the story that I published in the new Mythic, it's called Glyphlight, and that occurs in the same world as my novel Absolution, which is not yet published. So if you've been Googling it while we're talking, it doesn't exist yet. But yeah, that was the whole point of the new Mythic. We were giving a taste of a bigger world. For me and Ali, that was literally a novel we were working on, and mine is called Absolution. And much like in Glyphlight, it is about a world in which a certain species of monsters has kind of pushed humanity to the brink. They are surviving. They have like a coherent society, but only just. And without delving too far into spoiler territory, the general idea is that we're meeting this legendary demon hunter, but we are meeting him after he had already failed. He had his chance to make a big difference in this world. It didn't work out the way he had hoped, the way a traditional story would happen, and not many of his allies have survived. And we're kind of seeing him at the post credits of his story, in a way. He's alone. He's drunk. He's all alone, and then basically he finds out that he has a daughter, and the daughter is the key to a lot of things, and she's got her own very particular set of circumstances to deal with. And the story is kind of this dual story, her side, his side, her side, his side, of kind of trying to find something of a peace in this world, and to figure out basically what happened to the girl's mother. And even though it's a fantasy story, what I was really excited about when I started writing it is the father-daughter dynamics, which is they've never met each other and they don't have a relationship. And imagine this situation where you suddenly have to make a relationship with a family member that you've never known, and it's not a distant cousin. It's literally your father, your daughter, and the person that you had in your mind, because I imagine that you do make a person in your mind, especially the daughter, because she knew she has a father and he's alive. So you create this image in your head of that person. And I'm guessing that you're kind of setting yourself up to fail, right? Because most of the time, this person is not going to be what you imagined. And maybe if you had your expectations really low, they're going to exceed them. But I'd imagine for the most part, they're probably going to disappoint you. And that was kind of the inspiration for that story. It's like, okay, so you meet your father. Now what? Like, okay, he doesn't live up to your expectations. Okay, it's actually a lot worse than you imagined, because your mother was all these beautiful things and she was everything to you. And suddenly you meet this other half. And how do you go from there? I've always been fascinated by the idea of, is our family who we choose or who we are given? And we almost take that choice for granted when it comes to blood relatives, right? Like, mom loves me, dad loves me, I love my siblings. It's kind of an automatic relationship. It is that, maybe that's why that's the foundation of our lives, because that one relationship that, if everything's okay, is there for free, right? It is automatically there. You can always trust that it's going to be there. But how do you start it from scratch? How do you make that relationship from scratch with all the baggage and with all the disappointment of meeting a person that isn't who you hoped they would be? And all of that is basically mixed up with a lot of monsters and magic and demons and all the usual trappings of a dark fantasy book. So yeah, I wanted to write a story that's about monsters and, explosions and demons and all that stuff. But first of all, I wanted to be a story about family. And oof, man, I'm gonna sound so cheesy, but about learning to, I guess, learning to love someone.
Wonderful. That's wonderful. Yeah. And that kind of came about through the process of writing it. Is that correct? It kind of wasn't part of that's what came
Yep.
up. Okay.
Yeah.
That's very cool. Very, very cool. Okay. Can I ask then, when did this start, or when did you start writing this? With the caveat of like, is
Okay.
this a story that has been with you a while?
All right. It's like you don't ask a woman her age, and you don't ask Matan when he started working on a project. I started in June 2019. We're in August 2024. And I can pull out the C word. I can say, COVID. But is that an excuse? It isn't. The first 2 years of my process have been extremely productive. Probably get to 70,000 words, 80,000 words within the first year and a half, 2 years. And ever since, me and my wife, again, here's me with the excuses. Me and my wife we relocated back to Israel. And um it's been eventful, to say the least. But okay, listeners, I'm taking the optimistic route. Just because I didn't have time yet doesn't mean I'm giving up. I am going to finish this book. I'm going to finish it the way I want to. I already know how I'm going to finish it. I already have it mapped out. I'm very close to finishing it. It's not that far. And I will, but with school and everything that's happening, I'm not really sure how close that's gonna be. It kind of feels like when I have the time to do it, it's not gonna take long. It's not that I'm chipping every day, you know. It's like most of the time I'm not touching it. I've been writing Glyphlight in the meanwhile. I've been writing a lot of academic papers in the meanwhile. But yeah, I'm not gonna put a date on it, but it will be finished. After the new Mythic 2, whatever that's gonna be called, but it will be finished. I
Excellent.
hope
I think
that's
there's a lot to be. I think there's a
yeah.
lot to be said for those periods of kind of working and then taking a break and working and taking a break. Because you can find a story can change and a story can develop and a story can kind of grow with you. Do you find that that's happening? It sounds like that is what's happening with Absolution as well, that you kind of started as one thing and it's kind of formed into something else along the way.
Glyphlight was a great experience for Absolution because suddenly I was kind of looking at a different point of that world, and again, it's gonna sound cheesy again, but it kind of taught me things about the world that I didn't care to check before writing Glyphlight. And going back to Absolution, I feel like I'm more familiar with this world I created. And obviously, as you grow and your writing style change, it's always scary when you're working on the same manuscript for a long time. You're like, okay, is literally my prose going to sound the same? It's been like X amount of time. Like, do I still write in that way? Do I use the same similes? Do I use the same mannerisms with the characters? So every time I do go back to it, it's quite expensive, but I print the whole thing. um, which is
Oh
at the
wow,
moment, like,
okay.
yeah,
Wow.
I print the whole thing, pay a few hundred shekels for it. That's uh, convert it on Google, guys, if you really want to. But and yeah, I really am like I reintroduce myself to Absolution whenever I decide to pick it up. And sometimes these periods are like, okay, I reintroduce myself. I spend a few days or a week or two reading it, and then I might just push forward like 5,000 words and then drop it again. But when I do come back, that's what I'll do again. Because it honestly, it's stuff like literally remembering the story well enough to continue it. At times, I wonder, like, look at the guys like Patrick Rothfuss and George Martin, and I sometimes I look at them like they take years writing their novels, and I'm sure that it's a bit similar to our process where you drop it, you come back, you drop it, you come back, and like you kind of have to revert to whoever you were when you were writing that story, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. It does. If it makes you feel any better, there's a story I picked up writing probably in 2009.
Yeah.
And tried to write it for a year, put it down for a couple of years, tried to write it for a year, put it down for years. So yeah,
Let's go.
I think you're doing fine when feeling 2019 was a little while ago. That's fascinating. And how do you find when you do try to go back and try to be like, what was the mindset of at the time? What was it? Who was that person? Do you find that difficult to pick back up, or do you find it easy, or do you find?
Um, I'm gonna, what do you say? Here's my English as a second language showing up. Am I gonna toot my own horn or am I gonna hoot my own horn?
Toot, I think, yeah.
Okay, so I'm gonna toot whatever that means. I'm gonna toot my horn right now. And I'm gonna say Absolution is maybe the first project where I would reread it months later and I would absolutely love it. And in most of my rereads, I don't cringe nearly as much as I would with some other past projects. And so far, knock on wood, going back into it has been quite easy because it's, yeah, I reread it, I like it, I get back into it. And you know that, and maybe some of the listeners too, I'm a deeply fanatic architect when it comes to my books and stories. So there are whiteboards, there are sticky notes, there are piles of Excel documents with all this stuff. Honestly, that's really much of the fun for me when I know I'm going to go back to writing is just to jump into the Absolution folder and just like, these Wikipedias that some TV shows have, and you just find yourself reading the lore for, I don't
Yeah.
know, Lost, Breaking Bad, One Piece, whatever. I've got that little local Wikipedia for my absolution, and I really enjoy digging into it. So it's a fun process.
Yeah, I get that. That's very cool. Very cool. Brilliant. Well, yeah, thanks so much, Matan, for sharing that with us. I feel like this was a podcast of, or an interview of at least 3 or 4 questions that we probably could have gotten an entire podcast out of, because they were very interesting. I was definitely interested to get chatting with them about you. So thanks very much for giving us your time and getting into those with us.
Thank you, James. I really enjoyed this. I hope the listeners found at least some of it interesting, and be prepared, coming right back at you at the near future.
No worries. I look forward to it.
Good.
Thanks very much, listeners, for joining us for another episode of Pros and Cons. We hope you've enjoyed this, and be sure to sign in or to check in with us in a week or so when Matan will be doing his episode on short stories, which I'm sure will be extremely fascinating. So yeah, leave us a like or leave us a comment on whatever you're listening to, and see you next week. Thanks very much.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
You're listening to Pros and Cons, the Precipice Fiction podcast.